Welcome to Tripping Over the Ottoman. I'm David Van Deusen here with my co-host, Abby.
And David and I are two superfans from totally different generations that take a deep dive into episodes of the one thing that unites us.
And that is the Dick Van Dyke Show.
And today we're going to be breaking down, I would say, maybe one of the most beloved episodes of the series. I don't know if you agree with that, David, but it's
I do agree with that.
it's
Yes.
quite a fan favorite. I think we'll have some interesting things to note, specifically writing, directing, some lines that were new. It's going to be a lot of fun breaking this one down today.
And the episode is all about eavesdropping.
And this is season 3, episode 5, episode 67 of the series. I would say season 3 is the best season of the series if I had to label that. It's just the epitome of, you have seasoned writers working on sort of like well-loved and developed characters. The actors are all gelling. It's just a really, really, really good part of the series.
In classic style, the episode really all about eavesdropping, I would believe, is a takeoff of the film All About Eve from 1950
Yeah.
by Mankiewicz and Daryl Zanuck.
I was thinking the same thing. Yeah.
Typically, right, we have a little takeoff on the title, and I think that's the issue here.
It's interesting too, is it's not necessarily has anything to do with the plot of the episode. It doesn't tie in at all. It's just a reference to
Exactly.
something that's out there, which I think is kind of fun.
Yeah, popular culture that somebody's going to know,
Yeah,
right,
yeah.
is related to it.
David and I were very surprised that the script being so beloved, the episode so well loved, that it was not written or directed really by anyone we were expecting. We thought it was going to certainly be written by Carl, possibly directed by him or Jerry at that time, who was becoming, kind of a prominent director for the show. But it wasn't. It was written by a duo named Sheldon Keller and Howard Merrill.
Who interestingly wrote a number of episodes for the show, between 7 and 8, depending on how they were paired together. They appeared to be a writing duo partner. Sheldon Keller was a television writer for Sid Caesar, for Bing Crosby, Danny Kaye, Art Carney,
All the greats.
Engelbert Humperdinck, yeah, and Dick Van Dyke. And together they wrote 7 episodes, including this one, The Two Faces of Rob, another favorite. I Was a Teenage Head Writer. It's a Shame She Married Me. Too Many Stars.
That's a
The
great one.
Brave and the Backache. Yeah. And My Two Show Offs and Me.
And all spread throughout the season. So 2 and 3 and 4, just sort of throughout the show's run. Interestingly, a weird side note, Howard Merrill, it says online he was introduced to acting at age 3, that he was a child actor, and he appeared in 58 silent movies by age 11, making it into the Ripley's Believe It or Not for his record number of movies. Isn't it strange? I was like, that is
It
so
is.
funny. Apparently he transitioned to a successful television writing career somehow and all that. I don't know.
And I read that he made 487 radio broadcasts on 38 shows by the time he was 14.
Wow. So
And
cool.
also, I found it intriguing that with his partner, Alan Sherman, created the game show I've Got a Secret.
Yes, yes. A lot of talent.
So Sheldon Keller and Howard Merrill were our writers for this episode.
And the director is someone named Stanley Cherry. He apparently only directed this one episode of the Dick Van Dyke Show, but he is a prolific American television director of that time.
Directed Burke's Law, The Bill Dana Show, Flipper, Petticoat Junction, many, many more
Adam's
shows.
Family, Gilligan's Island, lots of good ones.
Yes, we were both struck by the fact as we compared our notes that at this point we thought it would have been one of our usual writers.
I think that just shows how great the characters are. And then the writing has been up and to that point that somebody could sort of take them and run with it and do an episode that really encapsulates everything so well.
So this episode was written in March of 1963, on March 12th, was revised later on April 5th, 1963, filmed on April 9th. Interestingly, though, although it was filmed at the end of the season, held for airing until the start of the next season.
Strange,
So it
right?
never aired until October 23rd, 1963.
Yeah, it's so interesting. So I have a couple synopses. You can tell me which ones you have, David.
Go ahead. I have a couple interesting ones too.
Okay. I have through Richie's toy intercom, Rob and Laura eavesdrop on a private conversation between Jerry and Millie. They discovered that it is probably better not to know what Millie and Jerry say about them when they're not around. Rob and Laura become infuriated just prior to attending the helpers' dinner party, making for a seriously disquieting evening. After the party, Rob and Laura decide they need to let Millie and Jerry know what happened and apologize, which is kind of got the crux of it, but not really.
I have having unintentionally eavesdropped on the helpers. Rob and Laura become infuriated just prior to attending their dinner party, making for a seriously disquieting evening. So that's sort of
Similar.
like the
Yeah.
one you have.
I have one other one. I've through Richie's toy intercom, Rob and Laura tune in on a conversation at the helpers and almost lose two friends. That was a pretty good
Oh,
one.
yeah. They do all summarize the gist of somebody overheard something that they shouldn't have, and it made it all go bad.
Yeah. Now, a couple quick notes, just personal notes. We all know this episode from the classic charades bit, which we'll get to later in when we break it down, but I love party games. I don't know about you, David, but I love charades. I love, Pictionary, celebrity, all these different games. And I have a little something also I want to share when we get to that point where you can actually watch some of these stars of the show do charades for real. And I'll let people know what that is. And then I love one room episodes. It goes back and forth between the living rooms, but really the most of it is just in a room talking, and I just appreciate those ones so much. So a couple other things of note. This apparently is the first instance of the third version of the opening scene where Rob sort of, instead of tripping on the ottoman, he avoids it, but then he stumbles a few steps later. I did not know that. The other thing is we don't often see Millie and Jerry's house, the interior of it, very, very, maybe a handful of times, I think. And then we also don't see Buddy and Sally at Millie and Jerry's very often. So it was kind of a bunch of things new for me, which was kind of fun.
Yeah, I think probably the only time that we saw Sally and Buddy at Millie and
I'm
Jerry's,
thinking
right?
so. Hmm.
Yeah. So our episode opens with Rob in the living room, sort of pacing around, waiting for Laura to finish getting ready in the bedroom. And he almost is having his own conversation with himself, is the way I would term it, because he's trying to get Laura to get ready. She says, can you wrap the wine? He says, I already wrapped the wine. He says something else, and she sort of like says, just a minute, darling, right? She's sort of not hearing anything that he's saying. And again, Dick just does some great stuff with facial expressions and responding to her.
Yeah,
And
like cutting her line off mid, kind of repeating what she's saying, kind of a thing. And yeah.
Dick's ability to react. And as you note, it's the third season. The characters are somewhat well defined, and the characters do have their rhythm built up.
Yeah. And Dick is especially good at these. There's the episode where he's home alone for a while, and the whole episode, the beginning of the episode, is him just sort of like talking to himself. And I feel like anyone else, it doesn't quite work. But when he does it, you just buy into it. Like, oh, he'd be talking to himself. Like he's just so good when he's by himself like that, with a little something to work off of.
In the midst of still waiting for her to get ready, he's wandering around the dining room and he trips over a toy ambulance that Richie's left on the floor and sort of, was upset. Why is Richie always leaving his toys here on the floor? And Laura says, just a minute, darling.
Any second now.
Yeah. So, but then he happens to stumble upon these other toys that have also been left, which I think are
This
kind
part
of fun,
is
right?
wonderful.
The water rocket launcher with nuclear warhead toy.
Or the Moon Anti-Aggression Massive Retaliation Mop-Up Kit. It's just hysterical.
And regardless of what Rob says, Laura doesn't hear him. And say, in a minute, darling. What I did was I went out and Googled just to see, was this a real toy that I could find from the era,
Yeah.
right? And I couldn't find it, although the things that they created clearly were topics of the day,
Yeah.
right?
Okay.
The moon anti-aggression and
Yes.
the nuclear warhead stuff that was going on.
Yeah, very timely.
I did that for those two toys, as well as the third toy, which Rob comes upon, which is the interplanetary intercom, and places it on the table, accidentally pushing the on button.
And there was you didn't find any intercoms for toys?
No intercoms. Although back in the day, they had them. A lot of times they were two phones, not
Yeah.
like this sort of model that we see.
Mm-hmm.
No, I Googled interplanetary intercom, didn't find anything, and I found nothing that resembled these. Although I think that perhaps they were real intercoms.
Yeah, possibly.
They looked like it, right?
Yeah.
They had wires, which of course could have been props, but I don't know. I just have the sense that they really were in intercoms.
Oh yeah, I think that technology could have been going at that point. So when Rob accidentally turns on the intercom, this is when the whole episode just starts to roll. He can suddenly hear Millie and Jerry having a conversation in their house. And we get that Rob tells us that Freddie and Richie have these intercoms hooked up to each other's homes, and now he can hear what they're saying, and he's very giddy about this.
Yeah, I like the fact that if the first thing sort of you hear is Millie saying "you,"
Yeah.
and that sort of like perks grabs Rob's attention. Like, where did that come from? Dedicated, fans who like the nitpicky stuff that we sometimes make reference to will note a little bit of a continuity issue here. If you go back and watch the episode, Rob has put the intercom on the table and it's gotten turned on. And once we hear the voices, there's a close-up shot of the intercom. And if you look very closely next to the intercom, you'll see on the table next to it is an ashtray. However, when the camera cuts back to a wide angle scene again,
No
there's
ashtray.
no ashtray
Oh,
to be seen on the table.
very cool. I didn't notice that. That's awesome.
So my guess is we'll talk about it again in the very end of the episode. Rob happens to turn the intercom on with his cigarette, right?
Yes.
Which has an ashtray right next to it. So my thought is that they did the intercut after the fact while it was sitting on the table next to the ashtray from
That
the
makes
later scene of the episode, right?
that makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
Edit it back into the earlier
Yeah.
version
That makes perfect
of
sense.
the episode.
Well, now Laura enters the scene and he's telling her, that it's hooked up, they can hear what they're saying. And she says, "That's eavesdropping." And he says, "Oh, honey, it's a toy. We're playing, kind of thing." And then he tells her, "Well, they can't hear us either because we have this, receiving button on, which means that we can hear them, but they can't hear us." So it's sort of Laura kind of hinting at him like, this isn't a good idea. Probably shouldn't listen. And him like, well, let's just take a listen.
And the conversation quickly turns to Millie asking Jerry, "Can you taste this dip?" Jerry says, "Well, sort of tastes a little drab." And Millie says, "Well, I don't know." She says, "I'm wondering if Laura maybe left something out of the recipe."
Now Laura wants to listen.
Yeah, Rob sort of looks at her and he says, maybe we should turn it off. So Laura says, "We've eavesdropped this long. We can eve a drop longer."
Well, and then the conversation starts to kind of spiral a little bit. I assume when people are at home by themselves, they sort of, they start ripping off of each other, and it kind of gets probably nastier than it would be, if you're in front of these people. So she says, "Well, maybe Laura left something out of the recipe on purpose, just so she can say she makes the best dip." And now Laura was like fuming hearing this, like how dare she? Which I think was a hilarious suburban competition between wives in the 60s, like who makes the best dip, as if that was like
Yeah.
the big thing.
Well, Jerry suggests, Laura wouldn't do a thing like that. And Rob sort of looks at
See?
Laura. But then Jerry says, "But Rob would."
And suddenly his face just drops.
Rob comes to attention immediately.
And then she says, "Let's turn it off now, Rob, in a second." Now he's mad.
So the conversation ensues. Jerry and Millie continue to discuss Rob and Laura and their competitiveness and their compulsive drive to be the best.
And now they're full on sitting at the table. Rob and Laura, they've like gotten down in chairs. They're sitting at the table, full on listening to the conversation, taking it all in.
And Millie says, "Well, I didn't think Laura could be so insincere." And Jerry's classic line that, again, gets quoted by fans, "Well, Rob is no Albert Schweitzer."
Do we know anything about Albert Schweitzer? Is this a made up name?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, no, Albert Schweitzer was a real guy.
Okay.
He was actually a medical missionary and he received the Nobel Peace Prize,
Oh,
believe
funny.
it or not.
Okay.
But he was also an organist and a Bach scholar.
Huh.
And therein lies the whole essence of the joke with Rob, because Schweitzer made recordings of Bach pieces.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, at the very end, Rob plays a Bach piece. So that's how it gets all tied in together.
Very cool.
But how they thought to
Use
pick
that.
Albert Schweitzer is a good
Well,
thing.
I was also remembering there's an episode where one of the characters' names is Alberta Schweitzer. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
I forget who played her, but they must have used that there too, just as a funny sort of, couldn't think of a name maybe, just went with something they knew.
Well, at this point, Rob and Laura are both highly offended, to which Rob, talks about Jerry's sort of going to get even with him. And he says, "Well, he's no Eleanor Roosevelt."
Just so funny.
Yeah, I don't quite know where that fits in, but an interesting comparison for sure. And I guess it is sort of interesting, right? When you figure we're 20 years past the Roosevelt administration,
Mm-hmm.
and Eleanor Roosevelt was still a pretty prominent
Respected kind of
woman, in the world and in politics and things.
Yeah.
So it was interesting that they chose to compare her. You wonder what she thought of that.
Yeah.
If she ever heard of it back at the time.
Jerry with Eleanor. So they decide they shouldn't go to the party. They don't want to go, but then they kind of come to their senses and say, well, we kind of have to go because Buddy and Sally are going and they're our friends,
So after much discussion, yes, they decide they have to go and attend the party, but almost like, but we're not going to have fun. And we're certainly not taking the wine to the party.
This is first scene. We're going to cut to Jerry and Millie's living room, and we're going to see Buddy and Sally there, and Millie and Jerry, and they're waiting for Rob and Laura to arrive for the party. And there's a little bit of a few lines in the original script that David and I have access to that didn't not make it into the final cut, and they're kind of fun. So we thought we'd maybe note some of those for you here.
Yeah, Millie originally says to Buddy, I'm sorry your wife couldn't make it, Buddy. And Buddy says, well, it's just one of those things, a freak accident. She put too much hairspray on her head and broke her
And
hair.
Sally says, "Come on, buddy." He's kidding, Mill. She's got a bad cold in her head.
And Millie says, well, I hope it doesn't go down into her chest.
Buddy says, "It won't. I tied a knot in her neck."
And at this point, Sally was supposed to go back to playing Pop Goes the Weasel. So apparently the scene would have opened with Sally
With Pop
playing
Goes
the
the
piano
Weasel.
a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it didn't happen. So at that point, Jerry comes in and says to Buddy, what do you have to drink, Buddy? And Buddy says, well, I'll have a bottle of beer. Jerry says, well, what's your pleasure, Sally?
This is a handsome husband and a house in the country.
Of course, she's after her husband, right? But Jerry says, well, how about a martini? And she says, I'll settle for that. Now, I think it is interesting. We didn't ever see this scene, but the context of it is there because if you look closely, while they're at Jerry and Millie's house, there is a point at which you can see Rosemary actually take a sip of a martini, but it's a brief and a quick cut. So you got to watch closely to see it. But the martini is there for Sally, even though we never saw it offered.
Definitely.
Since this scene didn't make it.
Very cool. Well, in the actual scene that aired, Buddy has his cello and Sally's at the piano, and we kind of get excited that, hey, maybe they might play their instruments, in the party. They're all wondering where Rob and Laura are. There's a discussion of like what might have happened. Like maybe they had a fight. And Sally says, oh, the worst thing they ever do is kiss hard.
You just mentioned the scene opens in there. Buddy is with his cello and Sally with the piano, right? To me, this is a glimpse, I think, into the real Maury Amsterdam, because this is what Maury did, right? He would do nightclubs and he would entertain with the cello. He would play little riffs. Yes. He would tell jokes. So to me, this was sort of a real good taste of what maybe Maury Amsterdam was really like. And I think really closely playing himself.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Kind of cracking the jokes here and there. And yeah, he's in his element for sure.
Yeah. And to back to what you said, Rob and Laura don't fight. The worst thing they do is kiss hard. Buddy, says, while we're waiting to Rosemary or to Sally, why don't you play the minute waltz? And she says, well, I only know half. So classic Buddy says, well, play it twice.
Could Rosemary play the piano?
Well, she could. And in fact, I'm not sure if she played the minute waltz here, but she definitely in the later segment played Aunt Rhody, right? Played the chords to Aunt Rhody.
Yeah. I didn't know how they would do that if you had to play and the sound had to, carry kind of through the audience. I didn't know how they would do that, but I guess probably have some recorded.
Yeah, the minute waltz I think was close to a cut because she starts to play and we cut back to Rob and Laura. But the little duet thing that she actually sang with Maury as Buddy, 100% confident that she played that.
Yeah,
so
it's very cool.
I never personally saw her play, but she had a piano in her home, and I think she did. That was among the things that she learned to do.
I would imagine you'd have to at that, in her kind of vaudeville days and things like that. You just sort of had to be a jack of all trades or Jane of all trades, I guess. But
yeah.
Now we're back at Rob and Laura's, and they're still determining if they want to go over to the party or not. And Rob's saying, well, we can't go. We can't act pleasant. We despise them kind of thing. And Rob says, do you know, accusing Laura of leaving something out of a recipe. Do you know what that is? That's malicious accusory.
If you say malicious accusory, any Dick Van Dyke Show fan will pop right up and know exactly that line, exactly the episode and the context in which it was used.
And it's fun because it's going to come up later in the episode again. So we get to hear it twice, which is so great.
Although, interestingly, later in the episode, it was not written in the script there. So
really,
Dick must have pulled it, ad-libbed and pulled it back.
That's genius. We'll talk about that more, I guess, when we get there. But wow.
So the other thing I think is fun here is that as they're talking about the dip, Rob refers to this dip as the greenish, brownish, sticky, lumpy stuff.
In the original script, it didn't air.
In the draft, right? So we never heard it referred to that in the actual episode. But I have to tell you that when you think of peanut butter avocado dip, now I like dip, but that when you say that, that's not something that I say. Oh man, I got to try that. In fact, you even wonder, peanut butter and avocado? What else could
Well,
possibly be in that?
a lot of people have tried to replicate this dip
Oh,
online,
yes.
and yes, and I've
Okay.
seen some. I have actually come up with one that I think works. And I will be putting that out a little bit later, I think, for fans. But I think I've concocted it. Now, it does. I think what they haven't achieved before was because they were trying to just use mustard, avocado, and peanut butter, like no other ingredients, which that combination doesn't even make sense, just cooking wise. So I think when you have to add other things, that's when you can actually get a dip that's edible. So, but yeah, it's so funny how Rob says you left the mustard out of the peanut butter and avocado. Like he can't believe this is a dip either. Like what?
So you've made a dip,
I
Abby?
have. I
And
have.
and what all I can envision is greenish, brownish, lumpy stuff.
Yeah, so I kind of been playing with if the recipe were made in this era, what would be the base of it? It would probably be like
Uh-huh.
sour cream, something like that. There was a lot of the sour
Uh-huh.
cream based dip. So once I took that and kind of channeled that into the recipe, I got something that was fairly edible. I will say it wasn't the best dip ever. It was probably not one I would make a lot, but I had some taste testers and they're like, yeah, I could eat that, so.
And visually appealing because it just somehow the greenish brownish thing just sticks in my
The
head.
other ingredients kind of mellow it out a little bit because yeah, if you just make it with avocado and peanut butter, it's nasty looking. Yeah, that's for sure.
And my thought here is when they made up this dip,
Yeah,
you would think that somebody says peanut butter and avocado.
I
Oh,
guess that's why it was funny. I guess
so Rob sort of questions Laura. You wouldn't leave out the mustard, right?
she just sort of has a face of shame.
Yeah, she sort of pauses and looks at him and he said, well, you didn't leave out the mustard, did you? And she sort of again doesn't answer. And then he said, you did leave it out, didn't you?
She says, "Well, I only left out the mustard. It was just to experiment, kind of thing."
Yes. Well, she said, what would our world be today without experimenting? We wouldn't be on the moon today. And
Which
Rob quickly says,
we're not
we're not on
on.
the moon.
Which, yeah, I guess the first moon would have been like 6 years later in '69, right? So we're not even
Right.
close. So sort of, Lord tries to, kind of change the subject a little bit. Like, well, forget the dip. They call this competitive and selfish and insincere, and we can't forgive them. And Rob says, yeah, and saying that I'm no Albert Schweitzer. Like those kind of things hurt, something like that.
With that, the phone rings and they're like, oh, they're calling to apologize.
For
Right.
what?
Yeah. And they're sort of back and forth while the phone is ringing and ringing. And Rob is back and forth and sort of just rambles and
Yeah.
rambles. And Laura says, what did you say? And he says, you unscramble it. There's a good sentence in there
Love that
somewhere.
part.
Right.
Well, because they didn't know what we heard, but they're guilty because they know they said it, even though they didn't know we know we know. So it's this whole big thing.
So Laura actually picks up the receiver, but doesn't say anything and is holding it and holding it. And with that, she hangs up the phone, click. And Jerry's like on the other end, well, what happened? And he said, I don't know. We got disconnected. So
And
he tries to call back and have them answer the phone again.
I love how he yells. He yells through the yard, "Hey, answer the phone over there!" And I'm thinking, how close are these houses?
Now,
Guess they're
I will
close.
say I will say this to you is that when I was growing up, we lived next door to my dad's best friend. They built their houses together and crossed each other. And I will tell you, there were times that my father would yell sort of out the door across the way, and his friend would hear him and he would yell back.
Oh
So
my
originally I was
gosh.
sort of thinking the same
Yeah.
crazy thing as you is how could he possibly hear him? But I have a real life
Yeah.
experience that
That's
would validate
awesome.
that.
That's so cool. When I love it, it's so cozy and intimate. The fact that they can have this relationship like that, it's so sweet. So Rob says, "Okay," phone rings again. Rob picks it up, and Jerry says, "Get over here. We'll join the party. We're all waiting for you." He says, "Is there anything I can do for you, Jerry?"
Very stilted and very straight, very
He
businesslike,
said, "Yeah,
right?
I'm gonna drag you over here if you're not here in 2 minutes." Hangs up the phone. So they decide to go. Okay, for Buddy and Sally's sake, they're gonna go. They're gonna leave the wine and go see Dr. Jekyll and Mrs. Hyde, as they say. So they're
So we forward to our next scene where we're actually at Jerry and Millie's house. And again, Buddy and Sally still seem to be entertaining.
Yep.
And they're all wondering what's keeping Rob and Laura. Finally, the doorbell rings.
now in the original script, though, instead of playing the cello or whatever, Buddy's actually telling a very long, strange little joke story at the beginning.
What was that?
So it says, a few minutes later, Jerry and Millie are seated, Sally at the piano, Buddy playing cello, and Buddy says, "Once upon a time, there was a beautiful young girl and a handsome young man. And the handsome young man took the beautiful young girl for a drive on a dark country road. And they stopped on this dark country road, and the handsome young man jumped out of the car, fixed the motor, got back in the car, and took the beautiful young girl home to her father and mother, safe and sound, once upon a time. And the moral of this story is, girls never go riding with a mechanic. So they all laugh. Quite a long little bit there.
Quite a long little bit that didn't make it for whatever reason, right?
They're waiting for them to arrive. The doorbell rings, and Buddy says, "Where are they?" And Sally says, not missing a beat, "They're probably outside the door waiting for the cello music to stop." That was great.
Yeah, so Jerry sort of says, "Come in." They don't come in,
Yep.
right? And at this point, I love
Yeah, I
this next
love
little
it.
bit, maybe because I'm a music person,
Yeah. Oh,
right?
it's wonderful.
But they all sing "Come in," like they all have their
Come
different notes.
in,
Buddy
come in.
starts, then Sally, Millie, eventually Jerry. At which point he gets to the final note, he opens the door,
Come in.
and there Rob and Laura are standing there, very deadpan
Yes.
faced.
Well, and it's such a fun little thing because we get like how musical these people are just on a day-to-day basis. Even Jerry, who's not really a performer, that this is part of their lives is like entertaining and games and music, and it's just really fun.
So Rob and Laura are standing there very stiffly with sort of grim looks on their faces. And Millie says, "Well, come on in. You've been missing all the fun." And Buddy says, "Yeah, I did 4 of my brand new jokes." And Sally remarks that she sang Bill Bailey so many times that he finally went home. Interestingly, Bill Bailey wasn't in the draft script.
Hmm.
Originally, Sally says she sang a chorus of Lazy River. So
Funny.
how we got from Lazy River to Bill Bailey, I
They
don't
used Bill
know.
Bailey
But
other times too in this series. It must be a favorite.
well, Jerry Van Dyke played Bill Bailey
Yes,
on the
yeah, that's
banjo,
right.
right, for his little
Hmm.
act.
So Rob and Laura come in and they say hi to Buddy and Sally. They sort of ignore Millie and Jerry, and they say, "Buddy, Sally, how are you?" And Sally says, "I'm still single, thank you." Which I
Yeah,
think is a great line. And then Laura says, "I'm going to keep my coat on. It's always a little cold in here," kind of.
yeah. Millie tries to
Yeah.
gently be a good host and ask if she could take it, and Laura quickly declines. Right?
Rob and Laura enter, and they do the most perfect bit of physical comedy, and they repeat it throughout the episode, which makes it even funnier. But they come to the couch together, they sit down in perfect unison, they cross one leg over the other, and then they fold their arms, all just do at the exact same time, and it is just hysterical. The audience loves it.
I would love to know. Was that the Stanley Cherry's direction? Did Dick come up with that? Did
Yeah.
somebody else come up with that? Did it come up by accident as they sat down and they said, "Oh, let's do it in unison to show that we're so tightly unified in
Yeah.
our stance against Millie and Jerry"? I don't know,
It's
but
great. Yeah, cool because they can't do much with the words because they're not speaking much. So it's a great way to get stuff across. So and Jerry says, "Well, what took you guys so long?" And Rob says, "We had a headache."
yeah,
Yeah,
we
we. Sally says, "Can't you afford separate headaches?" Which she laughs at her own joke and kind of just falls flat because everyone's just, in a mood. So they don't respond to her at all.
so being gracious hosts, Millie offers any number of things to try to help the situation. Could I get you an aspirin?
Yeah, glass of sherry.
Would you like some dip? And
No, thank you.
yes, the response after each of the offerings is no, thank you, but a particularly harsh one when they offer the dip.
Oh, and then they even answer in unison at one point. No, thank you. They both sort of
Yes,
answer. And then my favorite line is just sort of a line people don't even know is there because the audience laughs so hard at it that you can't even hear it. But it's my all-time favorite line of the episode, and it's Buddy's line where so they've said no thank you a bunch of times. Everyone's sitting in this gloomy silence, and Buddy just looks to Sally and goes, "I haven't had laughs like this since the St. Valentine's Day massacre." And the audience cuts it off. They don't even know what the end is.
the audience is so entertained by what else has already been going on that you almost lose the line.
And I think if you watch closely, I feel like Rosemary really laughs at that line. Like she has a very genuine laugh at Maury there.
At one point, shortly thereafter, again, Buddy and his cello, he starts playing the funeral dirge.
So much great comedy from the cello.
The room still is very tense, and Sally is going to try anything to salvage the evening. So she makes a suggestion. Again, this came from the draft script, so these lines never made it. So Sally says, "And right now, folks, in retaliation to your hostility, I'd like to do a medley of 84 Liechtenstein labor songs."
Millie and Jerry say,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah,
yeah.
yeah. Let's hear some of them.
So Buddy says, "Okay, well, why don't we do crazy song titles? How about Hume, Hume, get the broom. Grandma swallowed some birdseed and she's flying around the room."
Millie and Jerry laugh. Nothing from Rob and Laura. So they say, or
Or When we saw Grandpa coming home on a locomotive, we knew he was out on a toot.
Millie says, I like Hume Hume. Do that one again.
But he says, well, why don't I play a classical selection? The Bee.
And he starts to play.
Sally says,
That's
that stings. Oh,
Then Buddy says, okay, how about a romantic ballad about a nearsighted snake that fell in love with a piece of rope?
Sally says, try again.
A nearsighted alligator that fell in love with a pocketbook?
Rob and Laura again find no amusement in any of these jokes.
Buddy says, a pair of shoes?
And then Sally says, try turtle and army helmet. Now, this was the throwback to the line from the
Yes,
Walnut
it was in the
episode,
Walnut
right?
episode.
Where the nearsighted turtle fell in love with the army helmet.
So Buddy says, okay, a nearsighted turtle falls in love with a. Nah, I don't think I can get through to those two unless I fall into a bag of wet cement.
Intriguing to find these little snippets of draft
Very cool.
elements that never made it. We sort of skip past that. And in the real episode, the aired episode, how about we do a little folk song? So Buddy and Sally decide they're going to sing Go Tell Aunt Rhody. Rosemary actually playing the piano here. Go tell Aunt Rhody, go tell Aunt Rhody. She's really Uncle Fred. I don't know who came up with that.
But of course they don't laugh. Rob and Laura, they're sort of, sullen. And they kind of give up then to the entertaining. And Sally's kind of looking around the room for something to talk about or something to do. And she says, gee, what a beautiful ashtray. And she picks up this ashtray. And Rob says, we gave them that ashtray. We gave them this lamp, too. No special reason, just in friendship. And they're all kind of looking around like, what the heck? And there's this really long pause. And then Rosemary does, I think, the best kind of humor she does, which is sarcastic with this amazing comedic timing and pauses. And she just goes, boy, this is a beautiful ashtray. And she grabs it again. And you can tell Rob and Laura, they're kind of feeling sorry for Buddy and Sally here a little bit. They're like, yeah, sorry you're on the receiving end of our spat. But,
Millie's really out of her element here, trying to be a gracious hostess, trying to figure out a way to make the situation better. So she's just, maybe they play a game.
Yeah, one of the games they suggested, I think Buddy suggested, Who Am I? Which I assume is like 20 questions or something, where you guess who the person is. Oh, and then in the original draft of the script, they mentioned something like, let's play Ghost. I have no idea what that is. Did you notice that?
I don't know what that is either.
If anyone knows, let us know in the comments. And then Millie says, I got it. Let's play charades. And they're like, oh, charades. Great, great, great,
And Rob and Laura are still a little bit tentative on it. And come on, Laura, won't you play? And Laura finally concedes and says, well, it's your house. To which, again, Buddy follows up and says, you didn't give him the house? Because they've given him the lamp and the vase and the ashtray.
That's so
right?
good.
And the timing of Buddy's delivery is just perfect. Here and then begins one of the most memorable and enjoyed scenes by all Dick Van Dyke Show fans.
Now, the episode is like 25 minutes long. I was shocked when I looked. This whole charades bit, which is why everyone loves this episode, what everyone remembers, is only like a minute long. Not kidding. It lasts for 1 minute of 25 minutes. I mean, it's just unreal the kind of impact the scene has based on how little it was actually on the screen and how much we remember it and can quote it and everything. It's wonderful.
It's worth noting that most of the dialogue in the charades was scripted. I mentioned earlier that malicious accusory comes up again, but Dick threw that in apparently as we were going on here.
So old-fashioned charades were taken very seriously. There wasn't a lot of other entertainment at parties except for sort of like party games, and people took it very seriously. And I love that. I love watching games from back then about how they had hand signals, to indicate whether the person was right or wrong, or small word, big word. There was a very complicated little series of hand signals you had to know. And it was, like I said, it was taken seriously. And you can actually go on YouTube. There is a show. I think fans will really enjoy this. I love it. I watch it all the time. There is a show called Stump the Stars in 1962 that has celebrities on to play charades. And on one episode, the cast of the Dick Van Dyke Show is on playing charades with each other. And it is like a real life version of this episode scene. And it's fabulous. You will be shocked how good they are at charades. I mean, it makes sense with their comedic timing and they're, very smart, things like that. It makes sense. But it's really fun to see people that are taking it seriously and just having a ball at it. It's wonderful. I recommend it.
And they're competing as a team against another team, which I think has Sebastian Cabot is there. Pat Harrington, was Pat Harrington in that? Do you remember?
It sounds
Pat
familiar.
Harrington, who was on One Day at a Time. It is interesting because it's almost like watching an episode of the Van Dyke Show because you almost can envision this happening in Rob and Laura's living room while they're doing the clues.
And they all kind of are their character a little bit in real life. So it kind of comes through in that way too.
But go look for Stump the Stars on YouTube.
It's so fun. You won't be disappointed.
Our game begins with Laura giving clues. And what is the best part here is that Jerry's and Rob's guesses could not be any more opposing than they are.
It's like you got Jerry guessing a real thing and Rob's chiming in with all of his like grievances.
Yeah, so Jerry's like over, pat, beat. Rob comes in with crush, destroy, petty.
Jerry goes, what?
Hypocritical, two-faced.
Jerry's going, little, small word, and petty, hypocritical, two-faced. And then Jerry goes, that's a song title?
Walk all over people, goose step, stamp on people.
Second word is petty, two-faced. So Laura's, says she's going to do the whole thing now. She's going to do the whole thing. So she starts stomping around on the carpet, and she points to Millie and Jerry's faces. She grabs their faces, and at the whole time, Rob is guessing stomp all over people, walk all over people, goose step,
stab in the back.
And so Laura keeps saying yes, keeps adding to it, yeah. And then she's even doing like claws at one point, like she's clawing something, that kind of thing. And at this point, Jerry just stops guessing because he's like, what the heck is going on? He's just so confused. And then Rob says, treachery, two-faced, stab in the back. And Buddy and Sally on the side are like, what is happening?
And the best one, Pearl Harbor.
Well, and the best too, because it's right before he gets it. That's his last guess before, that's the one that clued him into it. He says, also, let's bring back that he did say malicious accusory. Indict, accuse, malicious accusory.
The culmination comes. Rob gives the answer on the street where you live. Yes, that's it.
Right.
And Laura and Rob, again, go back, and Laura and Rob in choreographed fashion sit back down on the couch. And Buddy and Sally and Millie and Jerry are all looking at each other like, what?
Jerry looks at the slip of paper like, hey, that is right. And then Buddy and Sally are sort of wandering back to their seats, and Sally's the best. She's so confused. She's like muttering to herself, like, on the street where you live, Pearl Harbor? Stab in the back? Like, where did this come from?
Millie looks at them and says, how did you ever get that? And Laura says, husbands and wives have a way of reading each other's thoughts. And I like it. I don't know if it's right here or it's some other piece of this. Mildred, right? She calls her Mildred, not Millie. She becomes Mildred.
Does. And then Rob says, it was perfectly clear to me, Gerald.
Mildred and Gerald.
Jerry says, man, this is so far out. And Buddy says, this isn't charades. This is a new game, World War III. Which I thought was great.
So in the midst of all this discussion and trying to figure out how they solve this puzzle, Buddy notices the peanut butter and avocado dip on the coffee table. He says, hey.
Which the audience already starts laughing, knowing that he's going to go try that and this whole thing is going to ensue.
So he says, how come you made it, Millie? This is Laura's specialty. So he takes a little taste of it, and he says to Millie, well, why'd you leave out the mustard? And Millie sort of looks at him and looks at Laura like, did you not tell me to put mustard in? And Buddy says, oh, that's okay. I like it better this way.
Hey, Millie does make it better. So then Millie and Jerry say, well, dinner's ready. We're all going to feel better after we've eaten. Buddy throws in his last insult to injury. Hey, Millie does make this better as he's, munching on the dip. So they all leave the room except Rob and Laura, presumably to go sit down for dinner. And Millie kind of yells at them from the other room, like, come onto the table. We're having dinner. So they get up kind of reluctantly. And Laura says, did you see how Millie acted? Like she weren't even angry about the dip kind of thing.
Yep.
To me, she's the one that's insincere. And Rob says, yeah, that's the difference between them and us, because when we're mad, we show it.
That's sincerity.
So Jerry yells, the food's getting cold, and they say, you'll be right there. And they decide kind of together, Rob and Laura, don't eat much. Just going to nibble kind of a thing. We don't want to show that we're too grateful for this meal. So presumably they eat dinner. We don't see that, but.
And our next scene transitions, to following dinner. And Rob and Laura are about to leave and go home. Sort of a very curt good night. And away they go. The door closes. And Millie and Jerry and Buddy and Sally sort of all look at each other to try to figure out what Rob and Laura's behavior was all about.
They throw out some various things, Buddy says, did you guys all have a fight?
Millie says, oh, it might be that I owe Laura money for Brussels sprouts.
They said, no. And Jerry said, well, did we offend him during the evening, And Sally says, well, you couldn't have because they came in angry. So that could be it.
Buddy finally determines the problem, and he says, what they need is on-the-spot relief from acid indigestion. Leave it to Buddy to always have a joke ready in that Rolodex of his.
Very, very big Rolodex, yes. So then we cut to Rob and Laura at home in their pajamas, kind of eating cereal at the dining room table. Since I guess we assume that since they didn't eat much dinner, they're kind of hungry. And we do see the intercom on the table. And we can kind of only hope at this point that think they might turn it on again, maybe just for some more shenanigans. We're wondering if it's going to be turned on
Yeah, they're
again.
certainly relishing the fact that they have ruined Millie and Jerry's party,
Yes.
and they're wondering
Yes.
about what's probably being said about them since they did ruin the party.
I think we showed them enough. Oh, we ruined their parties. That's for starters, and but you can tell here they're kind of feeling maybe a little tiny bit of guilt about how they acted, but they're kind of trying to reassure each other that how they acted was called for, like, well, I'd say it was coming. Oh, yeah. Well, after the nasty things I said, they're kind of trying to prove to themselves, that this was an okay way to act. And Rob's saying, I'm no Albert
Yeah.
Schweitzer. Those kind of remarks hurt.
So they pick up their dishes and about to head to the kitchen, and Rob has to go put his cigarette out. So he approaches the table where the ashtray is, but he misses the ashtray somehow and accidentally pushes on the button to the intercom again, thereby opening the line back up to Millie and Jerry's.
We hear them a little bit, and then we hear Laura, darling, I think you just turned on the intercom. He says, oh, I did. I guess I put my cigarette on it by mistake. She says, yeah, you better turn it off. He says, oh, I intend to. And they both just kind of look at the intercom and walk slowly toward it, waiting for some voices, And as soon as they hear Millie and Jerry start speaking, they're down on the chairs right up next to it, going to listen in.
And they do hear Millie and Jerry talking, and Jerry is very upset about what has transpired, sort of saying, I'm not sure that I can forgive them for this. And Millie, almost from the start, says, well, I think something was wrong. I'm concerned something's really wrong. Jerry says, well, maybe Rob's upset with the dental bill, right? I don't usually charge him for my labor, but the costs of some of the x-rays or whatever went up, and that's it. And Millie's like, no, I don't think so. And they sort of come around to the fact that Rob and Laura aren't the kind of people that would ever think that of their best friends or that they would take advantage of them.
That line kind of seals it for Rob and Laura, I think, of feeling guilty. They hear that and they go, oh, and Jerry ends with, I mean, they have their faults, but they're loyal people. Yes. And that kind of seals it for them. And they turn the intercom off. They're feeling pretty guilty. And then Laura says, just kind of breaking the silence, I did leave the mustard out of the dip, Rob says, I know. I also know I'm no Albert Schweitzer.
With that, Rob grabs the wine. And Laura says, are we going? He says, yeah. And if we're going to eat crow and swallow our pride, we're going to have something to wash it down. So they grabbed the wine that they had left behind previously before they went to the party.
So then we're back at Millie and Jerry's house, and I was thinking here of the setup of the houses. I know you were saying before how they could yell back and forth between the yards. Is the back door completely parallel to the front door in Millie and Jerry's house? It seems like they're side by side almost, or am I missing an angle? As the front door goes back. I don't know.
It seems to me that the back door, the screen door that Rob and Laura come in here in the end, sort of is straight across the back of the set, right?
Yeah.
And the door that they exited when they went over to the party was sort of at a right angle to that, or some sort of angle.
Yeah, I'm thinking maybe there was an angle I'm kind of missing in there. Yeah, that it was not exactly on the back. But so they come to the back door and in their jammies, I guess.
This is a rare look at Jerry and Millie's house because we don't often see it. This is probably the most that we ever did see their house and actually see their living room and have scenes take place here.
I think the other one notably is the one where they get invited. They think they're going to get invited to the party late that Rob is having, and they end up, at the restaurant at the end of the episode. I think there's a scene there where, Jerry's counting pennies or something like that, and Millie's ironing, and they're kind of having that's really, and of course you see the dentist office here and there. But I think as far as the house, that's really, you don't see it very much at all. And like we said earlier, you never see Buddy and Sally there for sure.
So all of a sudden, Rob and Laura appear at the back screen door of Jerry and Millie's house, and Jerry and Millie let them in, and Laura says, we want to talk about tonight. And Millie says, yeah, well, what happened? Did we say something to offend you, or what? Did we say something? And they said, well, yes, you did.
Rob grabs the intercom and he says, come in, honey, over. And so then Laura kind of recites what they said. Rob and Laura are selfish and insincere. And Jerry, Rob's no Albert Schweitzer. Over and out.
And then Millie sheepishly says,
so embarrassed.
Did you hear about the dip?
Laura says, oh, yes.
And I love Ann Gilbert's delivery. Oh, I'm so embarrassed.
And she clings to Jerry for a hug, and he's got his arm around her. It's okay, honey. And she's, oh, I'm so embarrassed. Her face is so funny. She's cringing, I will say here, too, just a little offshoot. We haven't talked that much about Anne Morgan Gilbert, but she was originally not really. She had a good audition, I think. But I think it said that Jerry Paris kind of pushed a little bit for her because, she wasn't your classic, Hollywood beauty type. And He'd seen her in all these musical reviews and things like that, and said, she's hilarious, she's funny. I think you should cast her. And when she came in, she did this killer audition, I guess, that kind of sealed it for Carl and Sheldon. Just like, yeah, that's the person. And so at his urging a little bit was like, no, give her a better look because yeah, she might not be your conventional beauty, but she's great, And I think, thank goodness, because she's hysterical.
There are some classic Ann Gilbert scenes that we'll cover, I'm sure, over the course of other podcasts too.
Yeah.
We talked about her previously. One of my other favorite lines is from A Bird in the Head Hurts, where she talks about the woodpecker being a glandular case, and the way she delivers that line is fantastic too.
And if you're looking for another little thing on YouTube to watch, there is a special that Dick Van Dyke did. Was it a year or two after the show ended?
1967,
David,
68, I think. Yes, a CBS special.
CBS special, and he does a bit. It's called "The Oldest Magician in the World," and he, of course, Rob plays himself, but then also plays this old magician. He does the great old man bit, and of course, the magician's horrendous. But his assistant is Ann Morgan Gilbert, who might even be funnier than he is for the whole sketch. So I think if you look up Dick Van Dyke, World's Oldest Magician, you're in for a treat. We were dying laughing watching it.
Yeah, and I'll tell you a little aside to the story. So part of the magic act that Dick does is Ann is his assistant, and as part of the act, she's levitated. And Ann's daughter Nora shares the story that she watched the special and saw her mom be levitated, and she said, "Mom, how did he do that? How did you do that?" And Ann would never give up the secret of how she was levitated. To this day, I don't believe Nora, Ann's daughter, still knows how the magic trick was actually executed. So that's a fun
fabulous
story.
Very cool. Well, so they're embarrassed, and Rob says, "Well, it was our fault for eavesdropping. We turned it on accidentally, but we should have turned it off." And Millie says, "Well, we shouldn't have been talking about you." And they say, "Well, if you can't say what you want in your own home about your friends, where can you say it?" Kind of thing.
And Jerry says, "Well, do you say nasty things about us other times?" And Rob says, "Well, we say less nasty things about you two than about any of our other neighbors."
So Rob gives him the bottle of wine, and I love Laura's line. "I just wish it could have been mustard."
And Billy says to Laura, "Come on, let's go make coffee."
I feel like the end scene is a real glimpse into the 1960s, like men and women dealing differently with conflict, between friends. So like Laura's like, "Oh, I'm so sorry, Millie," and she goes, they link arms, like, "Let's go make coffee together," and they wander off kind of hand in hand, and then Rob and Jerry are left sort of in the room alone to kind of deal with their like emotional unavailability, like kind of laughing and punching the air kind of thing, and haha to each other. They just wander around and chuckle almost, no one wanting to be vulnerable, kind of. And then Rob sits at the piano and plays a little tune.
He plays some Bach. And again, Dick is really playing the piano with sort of a smirk on his face, looks at Jerry and says, "What do you mean I'm no Albert Schweitzer?" And that's sort of the exclamation point at the end of the episode to drive the point home.
Wonderful episode. One of the all times. Great variety. You got drama, you have jokes, you have music, games, just all around fun. I think this episode might be so beloved, not just because of the charade scene, but because it's all the things in one. It's got all that variety, all the things we love about the show, the music, the jokes. It's got it all in one episode for us. And I think we love that, which just showcases everything.
And I think it's a nice showcase that we don't often see of Jerry and Millie, right? Jerry Paris and Ann Gilbert, which is really fun. And some of Jerry's reactions through the charades, his expressions and his remarks are classic.
And we have to remember, this is a very great third season where I guess I said it in the beginning, it's well seasoned. We got great characters, great storylines. They're very developed. The actors are gelling so well, playing off each other. It just turns that with a great writer and great director, just it's perfection.
One of my favorite episodes, absolutely in the list of mine. Well, fans, we hope you have enjoyed today's look back at All About Eavesdropping.
And if you'd like to get notified when new episodes are out, just subscribe to our channel, and you can also find us on all the major streaming platforms.
And remember, we are a community, so we value your comments, your questions, and your contributions to the discussion about this episode and all the others. So feel free to leave some feedback on our YouTube channel or send an email to us at trippingovertheottoman@gmail.com with a subject of Box 7030. And we'd love to get your feedback and your comments and hear your suggestions about what other episodes we should do in our future podcasts. For today, I'm David.
And I'm Abby. And thanks for tripping over the Ottoman with us. We'll see you next time.